Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined at the desk by Niall Stanage.
Great to see you, Amber. Look forward to this every Friday. Always enjoy our conversations.
Such a treat. All right. And meanwhile, on the global stage, the trade war between the United States and China is heating up.
China's Ministry of Finance announced that Beijing will raise its tariffs from 84% to 125% on all U.S. goods.
In a statement, the Ministry of Finance said, given that American goods are no longer marketable in China under the current tariff rates, if the U.S. further raises tariffs on Chinese exports, China will disregard such measures. Chinese President Xi Jinping broke his silence on the tariff war Friday, saying, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation. For over 70 years, China's development has relied on self-reliance and hard work, never on handouts from others, and it is not afraid of any unjust suppression.
China also said that America's tariffs have become a joke, since the numbers are supposedly so excessive that they're meaningless. If the US continues, however, China said it will fight to the end and counterattack. President Trump's tariffs on China currently stand at 145%.
Here's what U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had to say Wednesday after China initially raised their tariffs on the U.S. to 84%.
Well, Maria, I think it's unfortunate that the Chinese actually don't want to come and negotiate because they are the worst offenders in the international trading system. They have the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world. And I can tell you that this escalation is a loser for them.
Contrary to Bessent's implication, however, the Chinese Commerce Ministry said that they are open to negotiations with the U.S.
Today, US markets opened slightly higher. The S&P jumped a fifth of a percentage point, the Dow was near the flat line, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq rose by 0.4 of a percentage point. The markets in Asia were a bit of a mixed bag. At the end of Friday, Japan's Nikkei index dropped almost 3%, South Korea's KOSPI dropped 0.5%, and Taiwan's composite index almost rose 3%.
Shark Tank star and investor Kevin O'Leary went viral this week advocating for an even more hardline stance on China. O'Leary said that the tariffs on China should be increased by 400%. Since China doesn't play by the rules, O'Leary says the U.S. should punish them more and force them to the table.
Chief economist and global strategist at Europac, Peter Schiff, warned on X, because China has raised tariffs so high on US goods, the Chinese will now buy those goods from other countries. Since those other countries will now earn more money selling their goods to China, they will have more money to buy Chinese goods, replacing Americans as customers.
President Trump took to Truth Social this morning and wrote, "We are doing really well on our tariff policy. Very exciting for America and the world. It is moving along quickly. DJT."
So I imagine we're going to get off to quite a discordant start here in terms of what we think of these things. I think in broad terms that President Trump has got himself up a cul-de-sac with a pretty disastrous policy and is now trying to back out of it. That is not to defend everything that China does by any stretch of the imagination, but these two countries together comprise about 40% of the global economy. A trade war between the two at this pitch seems fundamentally a bad idea.
I completely disagree. No surprise, I'm
no
sure
surprise,
to you.
no.
Yeah, China is such a bad actor on the global trade markets that I think it's well past time that the U.S. take this problem seriously. Of course, Trump did institute a lower level of tariffs on China during his first term, and those were mostly continued by the Biden administration because they agreed that it was a good idea to start making sure that China is held accountable for the fact that they routinely steal IP, they steal trade secrets from the United States, they artificially inflate their currency, and a whole other host of bad decisions on their part if they want to claim to be free traders, which they're not. And I think you've seen other European countries as well start instituting tariffs on China over the past 5 to 10 years because they similarly recognize that China is not a good trading partner. And outside of the unfairness aspect, the Chinese markets are really not that compelling for businesses. They have had their consumer purchasing power decrease significantly. Their currency is actually deflating, even while they try to artificially inflate it. And so really the only strong part of their economy is their exports. So I think the US has way more leverage here on China than China has on the United States.
So I would respond to that with a couple of points. One, in relation to Chinese exports to this country. If you put on tariffs at the level that Trump is doing, which no European country is doing, then you have about 60 billion a year in mobile phones, about 30 billion a year in toys and games, about 20 billion a year in tariffs and garments that are all basically doubling in price, or the tariff is more than 100% of the price. Now, we then cycle back to the fact that President Trump was elected in part because of inflation and the problems that go with inflation. So these tariffs are likely to drive inflation here in the US. Now, in relation to China as an export market, its population is about 4 times the size of that of the United States, and it is broadly becoming a more prosperous nation than it certainly has been earlier in our lifetimes. And that is why you have lots of people from Apple to car manufacturers across the board wanting to concentrate more on China. The reason that Biden and the first Trump administration put those tariffs in place were the genuine issues, and we were talking about it in the context of TikTok last week, I think, about the Chinese government influence on its industry, whether it's a malevolent player in that way. But there is a persistent problem, I would argue, with the current president, which is the propensity to seek easy solutions in inverted commas, for difficult problems, which then blows up in his face. And we have seen that over the past week, where the bond markets were spooking him, the stock market was spooking him, rightly so, given the way that those had been, the bond market had been going in the wrong direction and the stock market had been losing value, and that's why he has reversed most of the tariffs and he's holding on to China, obviously.
Yeah, I do think that the 10% baseline tariff is a much sounder policy than the reciprocal tariffs, which really weren't reciprocal because apparently they weren't going to lower those tariffs in accordance with other countries trying to come to the table and lower them, because in part they included numbers related to the trade deficit and non-tariff related barriers. I think a 10% baseline is much more stable in terms of how the market's going to react, and also gives countries time to actually come to the table and negotiate. But I think what worked out really well, even though I don't buy the White House's idea that this was the plan all along, is that by starting with such an aggressive strategy, we have now seen that the sort of implication that this was going to send our allies running into China's arms turned out not to be true. We had more than 70 countries immediately come to the US with the intention of negotiating those tariffs. And now China is essentially on an island with no one wanting to go to China to negotiate a higher level of trade in lieu of the US being this sort of open air market were both imports and exports, because we previously did not have tariffs. And I think it's important to point out too that part of Trump's approach to this is multi-pronged. It's not just tariffs when you're talking about prices potentially increasing, because he also wants to institute a massive tax cut for Americans, which would give them obviously more purchasing power. He also has been deregulating energy and also trying to increase agriculture in the United States. And of course, food and energy are 2 of the largest drivers of the consumer price index.
I think we're almost out of time, Amber, so just very briefly, what I would say there is that you say multi-pronged. I would say a shifting rationale all the time for this tariff regime, because is he trying to rejuvenate American manufacturing? Is he trying to raise revenue? Is he trying to flex his muscle to get quick deals? Some of those objectives move in different directions, which I think is why there has been so much uncertainty over the past week.
Yeah, I would just one quick sentence to end us off. I would say that that is intentional. So the point of isolating China is to reshore manufacturing in the U.S. in places where we might have a comparative advantage or need it for national security reasons. In other certain industries, like clothing, for example, we would want to move those industries to countries that are friendlier to us.
I shall give you the last word on that.
Thank you.
Coming up, more on Rising. Stay with us.
House Republicans recently pushed through a bill that has voting rights groups sounding the alarm.
In a mostly party line vote Thursday, the House passed the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, or SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship, like a birth certificate, to register to vote. But advocates are saying the new law will disenfranchise marginalised communities who may not have access to the proper documentation and create a barrier to voting for the millions of Americans who have changed their name, including women who have taken their spouse's last name.
Republicans passed the bill to cut down on non-citizen voting, something that Democrats point out is already illegal. And many on the left are now decrying the effort as voter suppression. Here's Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar.
Effectively, if you are a woman, you are married, you changed your name, and it doesn't match what is on your birth certificate, you are not going to be able to vote. If you are disabled and you can't physically get to an office to register, you are no longer going to be able to register online. This is not about creating election integrity. It is about disenfranchisement and choosing who can vote and who cannot.
Florida Representative Byron Donalds had something to say about that Thursday night on Cuomo.
To the people who are concerned about married women being able to register, there's this thing in the United States, every state does it now, called Real ID. Every state, through their identification systems, actually track things like birth certificates, etc. And as long as you have a Real ID, which virtually every American has to have today, it should be easy for you to register to vote.
Well, I took the lead on our first segment, Amber, so why don't you tell me what you think about this?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, to me, this seems like such something that they shouldn't be fighting about. It should be a bipartisan issue. I think it is a no-brainer that people should have to prove they're citizens to be able to vote. Illegal immigrants should not be able to use a driver's license that they get in some blue state to register for vote and potentially illegally vote in a federal election. I find the argument about voter suppression quite absurd. Democrats have been using that line for years, even with things as simple as voter ID laws, which pretty much every country besides the U.S. has in place. So I guess I don't see the big consternation or the reason for it.
Well, I think the reason for the consternation is the idea that are you proposing a remedy that is disproportionate to the actual problem and thereby causing a bigger problem. In other words, the evidence for non-citizens voting is very, very scattered indeed. The famous one that people often cite is a 2016 study from the Brennan Center. It surveyed 23.5 million votes cast and found 30 that were under suspicion of being cast by illegal immigrants or people who were not entitled to vote. Now, there is a separate issue where there have been measures made, or measures attempted, I should say, by certain states to crack down on this alleged problem, and they have run into difficulties, one being Virginia, another one being in Alabama. In the Virginia case, there's a measure that provides for a 90-day quiet period before elections where you're not supposed to throw people off the voter rolls and because they're perceived not to have enough time to seek redress. Glenn Youngkin did that very controversially. It was struck down by some courts. It was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court. But wrongly in my view, but I don't have a vote on the Supreme Court decisions. In relation to Alabama, the Secretary of State there did a very peculiar thing, which was insist that anyone who had ever had what's called an A number, which is something that non-citizen immigrants have, should be thrown off the rolls and then have to reapply if they were legal. The problem with that is it basically punishes naturalized citizens who at some point in their lives all had those A numbers, and there were many people thrown off the rolls in that respect who then had to either go through an onerous process to get back on them or who were caught in the net. A Trump appointed judge, I should say, at one point halted that program. So I don't think it's right to just say, to act as if there is no danger of disenfranchisement when I think there clearly is.
Well, I think the problem with using a 2016 study is that since then there have been numerous instances of localities, counties, states, both providing illegal immigrants with driver's licenses and allowing them to vote in local elections. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that we're going to see an uptick in foreign nationals voting in federal elections because of that movement. We saw 19 foreign nationals charged in 2020 in North Carolina for illegally voting in the 2016 election. In a North Carolina case in 2018, 19 foreign nationals charged with voting in the 2016 election. And I find that pretty significant because we know that voter fraud is incredibly difficult to find, investigate, and actually charge. So the fact that they were able to find that many, that's 19 plus 18, almost 40 American citizens who were disenfranchised by the fact that their votes were potentially undermined by a foreign national voting illegally in the election. And I think it's kind of offensive to say that Americans can't get a driver's license in the case of a voter ID law. And this whole
but hold on,
Go ahead.
there is a difference between voter ID and proof of
Yes.
citizenship.
Yeah, I was
and
gonna
a
get to
driver's
that.
license does not prove citizenship. But
Right, yeah, I was going to get to that. So at this point, pretty much every American has to get a real ID, which does confer proof of citizenship. Now, on the married women question, I feel I can speak uniquely to this as someone
Sure.
who did change their last
Sure.
name in the past couple of years. And again, I think this is a smokescreen for what the Democrats are really doing here, which is they just want to make it apparently easier to cheat in federal elections, because married women, when you change your name, you start with your social security number, your social security card, then you do your passport if you have one, and then you do your driver's license. For all of those federal documents, you have to provide your birth certificate and a copy of your marriage license. So any woman who has gone through this process already has those documents on hand because they wouldn't have been able to do this legally unless they had them. And so they can provide the exact same documents to register to vote and prove that they are a U.S. citizen.
let me take the first point you made first,
Sure.
because the married women thing I've less disagreement with you on. But in relation to this issue, which you're suggesting is a widespread issue, and you cited some of those statistics, people on the Conservative side are often skeptical of the Brennan Centre because I think it's perceived to lean liberal. The Heritage Foundation has a map on its website about instances of fraudulent voting. And the thing that struck me when I looked on that website was how scattered and small the examples are. So, for example, in Minnesota, you can look it up by state, and in Minnesota, there are 16 examples in the past decade. Now, that's 16 over 10 years in a state that has 5.8 million people. And when there is the charge on the Conservative side that Democrats are doing this to encourage illegal voting, the suggestion is they are doing it to encourage mass illegal voting. Now, the statistics just don't bear that out. You mentioned the North Carolina case. There were indeed 19 people indicted for that earlier this year. 9 of them face up to 6 years in prison. Well, 2 of them include a 71-year-old Guyanese woman and a 64-year-old Panamanian woman. Among this 9 people in a significantly sized state in North Carolina. Is it more likely that a 71-year-old Guyanese woman has decided to risk 6 years imprisonment to cast her own vote? Or is it more likely that that is somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't quite understand the regulations and has cast a vote in error? The idea that this is some factory to manufacture voting on a scale that would thwart the outcome of American elections is just, I think, an implausible idea.
I don't think it would necessarily be at the scale to change the results of an election, but the point is even one is too many because it disenfranchises people who do have the right to vote in this country.
But what about if the measures, as in the case of Alabama, throw off people with the A number who are entitled to vote? They have also been disenfranchised.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that's a separate issue than the one we're talking about, which is the SAVE Act, right? But I would also say, in North Carolina, back when they implemented a voter ID law, I believe it was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, there was a massive argument from the left that they were going to disenfranchise African American voters specifically, which again is sort of the bigotry of low expectations. I believe Thomas Sowell first used that term of assuming that black people were not capable of getting a driver's license. And I feel the same with the documentation that's required here. But they actually found that African American voting rates went up after that law was implemented. So I just think the totality of the evidence suggests that this is not a massive burden for most Americans, shouldn't be taken as evidence of disenfranchisement. And I would also point out, the Carter Center used to agree with Republicans on this. They used to say that because voter fraud was so hard to identify, that the number of cases that we have been able to identify suggests it's a much more widespread problem than anyone realizes.
In relation to the partisanship, I have quite deliberately here, not made the partisan argument, because I don't think it is clear that the kind of measures that are being sought here would necessarily disadvantage Democrats or demographic blocs that typically vote predominantly demographic like black people. And one of the interesting things about the proof of citizenship as opposed to proof of ID is the issue of people using passports. And as I'm sure you're aware, the concentration of passport ownership is actually significantly lower in several red states, particularly in the Deep South, Mississippi and Tennessee, among the lowest in the nation. So my argument isn't really it will advantage this party or that party. It is that the restriction risks creating more damage than it purports to resolve.
Yeah, I don't view it as a partisan issue either. If there's Republicans versus Democrats being disenfranchised, that doesn't change my calculation of thinking it's incredibly important to make sure we have secure elections, especially after 2020. There are so many people who lost faith in the electoral system. I think it's important for us to make sure that those people have faith in our elections, I would say not just Republicans, Niall, in 2020, but a lot of Democrats in 2016 did not trust the outcome of the election. You can look at polls related to that of what they said. They said that Trump was an illegitimate president. A significant portion, at least 1/5 of Democrats, did not think that was a fair election. When we have a massive bipartisan agreement that our elections are not secure, I think it is incumbent on elected officials to do everything they can to restore that faith.
The reason that there was a large falling in faith in elections after the 2020 election was because the defeated Republican nominee kept lying about it.
No, it was because they changed the rules in the last minute related to COVID.
Next on Rising, what's next for Democrats as they grapple with their response to the second Trump presidency?
Of course, President Trump's astronomical rise in politics will be studied for years to come, but with a party in as much disarray as the Democrats, students of history will have a lot to ponder. In a recent piece for The Spectator titled, "Can Democrats Rediscover Themselves in the Age of Trump?" Aidan McLaughlin highlights the powerlessness the party has been forced to reckon with. This includes losing support among key voting cohorts and being left with no clear path or leader after a blistering loss in November.
Relative newcomers to the party, like AOC and Congressman Ro Khanna, might offer a lifeline to the deeply unpopular neoliberals at the helm, but will it be enough? Joining us now to elaborate on his article is the editor-in-chief of Mediate, Aidan McLaughlin. Welcome, Aidan.
Thanks for having me on.
So, first things first, how deep is the trouble that Democrats are in, according to your reporting?
So, I spoke to a series of Democratic operatives for this piece, people like James Carville and Paul Begala, who have been doing this for decades. They said that they've never seen a hole like this for Democrats. They lost the election to Donald Trump. They lost the House of Representatives, the Senate, and they're now in what a lot of people describe in the party as the deepest hole in decades. And it's important to remember that the voting blocks that they lost to Trump in 2024 were some of the key voting blocks that Democrats have traditionally relied upon to win elections. Paul Begala put it to me, I thought the most striking detail of this was that the Democratic Party lost voters that make less than $50,000 a year. And he described that as an existential crisis because it means that the Democrats can no longer claim to be the party of the working class, which they have done for decades now. And so that was the electoral hole that they find themselves in. Then after the election, Democrats, in terms of their approval among the American people, are at their lowest point. They're at the least popular point in decades. And so you have this incredible hole that they're in. Meanwhile, they're up against Donald Trump, who's perhaps at his most formidable in terms of his power and his ability to operate with impunity and his grasp over the Republican Party. And that puts the Democratic Party in a really, really tough spot because the voters, on the one hand, are desperate for them to do something. And they're caught in this powerless position where there's not a lot that they can do. So it's a real problem for Democrats, and it's hard to see, and that's sort of the answer that I tried to bring with this article, how they're able to make their way out of this.
And I've been on the opposite side talking to Republican strategists about this issue to kind of get their outsider perspective. And one of the things that they point to is that the Democrats for a long time focused on targeting demographic groups, whereas Republicans are targeting class groups and even individuals with micro-targeting. Do you think that the fact that Democrats lost young voters, so we saw shifts in Black men and Latino voters, will they start to move away from this sort of demographic-based targeting model of the electorate?
I think a lot of leaders in the Democratic Party would like them to. I mean, some of the key people that are seen as the Democratic leaders that could take the party out of the wilderness. As you noted, AOC, Ro Khanna, Bernie Sanders, although I think he'd probably prefer to pass the baton to a younger generation. They've been arguing that class is a much more important thing to focus on than these sort of racial demographic groups. And I do think that the Democrats in 2024 did try to move away from that message. But because of I'd say the hysterical days of 2020, when Democrats really, really embraced this sort of identity-based politics that was censorious and turned off a lot of Americans, it was very, very hard for the Kamala Harris campaign to rid itself of that perception that she cared more about racial identity and class politics than she did about making Americans' lives better. And that's ultimately what a lot of Americans, when you look at the exit polls after the last election, said about the party. And so there needs to be an enormous amount of work done to rethink what the Democratic Party stands for and what it means for Americans. And then they need to figure out how to message that. And that's what AOC and Bernie Sanders have been doing on this speaking tour around the country. Ro Khanna is doing a similar speaking tour around the country. And they're labeling these anti-oligarchy tours, which I think is pretty potent messaging for targeting the Trump administration, which is stocked with billionaires and obviously has Elon Musk, who's not an elected government official. He's a special government employee who's running around, working to gut the federal government. That is really the message that I think Democrats should rely on going forward. And it is one that they've been trying to make for the last couple of years against Trump, arguing that he's a billionaire who doesn't actually care about working class, middle class Americans. But it's an argument they clearly lost in the last election. And I think that it would be a problem for Democrats if they tried to rely upon the sort of passive argument that they lost the last election because of inflation, which it needs to be said. Plenty of incumbents around the world got deposed because of post-COVID inflation. But there were also incumbents across the world that won re-election. And so I don't think that is a strong argument for Democrats. They need to actually figure out how they lost all these key demographics and figure out how they can win them back.
And to that point, Aidan, looking at this in the biggest possible picture way, I think one of the things that has disoriented Democrats and liberals more broadly is this sense that there has been in some way a cultural shift against them or in a conservative fashion. And you note in your piece that I think you say Democrats, it is very clear, have no earthly idea how to win the culture back. And you cite Gavin Newsom doing those podcasts where he has had Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk on with him, but hasn't exactly made him the Joe Rogan of the left. So is that something that is a real problem that Democrats continue to grapple with, in your view?
Oh, that's a huge problem. I mean, I think this is a key part of it. For the first time in my lifetime, Democrats lost control of the culture. I think for years, Democrats were really at the center of the culture. They controlled, basically, late night, like any sort of, media outlets are, I would say, overwhelmingly liberal in their leanings, with obvious exceptions. And I think you can trace it back to not just the way that Democrats positioned themselves after 2020, which I do think had a serious effect on this, but the decentralization of media, the fact that Americans don't watch the same news anymore. We don't live in a monoculture anymore. And that really accelerated during the 2020 campaign, where you saw podcasts become an enormous part of Americans' viewing habits. And previously, mostly apolitical podcasts like the Joe Rogan Show really, really lean into politics, and specifically politics that were pro-Donald Trump. And so for the first time in my lifetime, younger voters were watching news that was right-wing. And that has never happened before. And it is an enormous problem for politics. And that's why in the aftermath of the election, enormous problem for the Democratic Party. That's why in the aftermath of the 2024 election, you had Democrats hand-wringing about how they needed to have a Joe Rogan of the left. Now, it's not clear that you can just have this immaculate conception of that kind of powerful, potent political communicator, especially because Joe Rogan didn't start off as a political communicator. And so there have been various attempts to try and fill that void. Gavin Newsom is probably the most comical and I'd say ineffectual of those. His podcast has not been getting good reviews. And I think if you're trying to appeal to a Democratic base, which is typically what Democratic politicians will do in the run-up to an election. There's a way to do that as a moderate. The way not to do it, I would say, and I don't want to make any predictions here about how Gavin Newsom will fare when he inevitably runs for president in 2028, but inviting on Steve Bannon for a fun chat is not the way to do it, because bridging the divide between the right and the left is one thing, and I think that's a really noble and very worthwhile politically, practically speaking, thing to go for. But Steve Bannon is probably arguably on the extreme of the Trump movement, and treating him to a puff piece interview is just not the way you're going to win back Democrats.
One thing that I found fascinating about the Democrats' post-mortem, so to speak, is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of agreement on this cultural question. I mean, you have James Carville saying the party needs to get away from woke, they need to stop talking about identity politics, stop the language policing. But then you have Governor Tim Walsh, who was the vice presidential nominee on this ticket in 2024, saying actually the problem was that we weren't proud enough of those policies. How do those two competing visions end up with the party in a place where they have some agreement on what the right message is? And also, is it the message or is it the underlying policies? I feel like the fundamental problem to me when I look at the Democrats is that they think they just need to package the policies better, but maybe the policies are just bad.
So this is something that when you talk to Democratic operatives, almost unanimously, they are furious that the party went down this identity politics path. And they're screaming at the top of their lungs for the party to correct and to focus on the voters and their needs, as opposed to picking silly little culture wars that they're obviously going to lose. And they see that as the key reason why they lost these very important demographic groups, Black men, Hispanic voters, younger voters, to Republicans. And the way to win that back is to move on from those days of 2020, which I think the leadership of the party really realizes were a mistake. You have certain factions of the party that push back on that, and that's maddening for these Democratic operatives. Ultimately, I think it's just so obvious that that's what they need to do to ever win an election again, that they're going to move on from that, and that I'd say the sort of more moderate side of the party is going to win, at least on that issue. So I do think that Democrats will sort that out by the time the next election comes around.
All right, Aidan, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, coming up, Trump is finally considering making exceptions in his mass deportation plan. We'll tell you more next.
So it looks like President Trump might be changing his tune toward at least some illegal immigrants. In his cabinet briefing, Trump floated a plan for some undocumented farm and hotel workers. Let's watch.
And we're going to work with people so that if they go out in a nice way and go back to their country, we're going to work with them right from the beginning on trying to get them back in legally. Is that right? So it gives you a real incentive. Otherwise, they never come back. They'll never be allowed once a certain period of time goes by, which is probably going to be 60 days. We're also going to work with farmers that if they have strong recommendations for their farms for certain people, we're going to let them stay in for a while and work with the farmers and then come back and go through a process, a legal process. But we have to take care of our farmers and hotels and various places where they need the people. And we're going to be working with you very carefully on that. So a farmer will come in with a letter concerning certain people saying they're great, they're working hard. We're going to slow it down a little bit for them. And then we're going to ultimately bring them back. They'll go out, they're going to come back as legal workers. Okay?
It's still unclear what President Trump means by slowing it down. So, Amber, on this one, I know you have other immigration cases that you want to talk about once we get past this, so I'll just put forth my views on this, which gets back to something we were talking about in an earlier segment of the show, which is my contention that the president is prone to overly neat or sloganeering solutions to things that are actually quite complicated. And so on immigration, he obviously does propose, I think, a pretty hard line by his own view, his own words, talking about the idea that there has to be a crackdown, people have to be removed. Now then you get into the agricultural sector, where according to the Department of Agriculture, 47% of hired workers are illegal immigrants. That poses an obvious practical complication. Now, of course, you can argue, well, those people shouldn't be there at all, so kick them out. And then you have to find the American workers to do it, which would presumably be seeking higher wages, which leads to higher prices. Or you can say, well, we'll come to some kind of accommodation, which is what Trump seems to be suggesting there, although the details of it are vague. Much the same in the hospitality industry, which is estimated to have more than a million illegal immigrants working within that. So to me, the tension is just the kind of sloganeering or headline solution, and then a more complicated reality with which Trump has to grapple.
Yeah, so I think it's probably going to be no secret that I think this is a horrible idea, and it's not what Trump ran on, which was deporting all illegal immigrants, and they shouldn't be given a pass just because a farm worker went, or an agricultural, farm owner, probably from a big corporation, mind you, went to Trump and was like, hey, Trump, I really need these guys. Please, I don't want to have to pay American wages and give benefits to workers who are here, which is precisely the problem that so many conservatives have identified with mass legal immigration, which is that it does undercut American wages. Yes, prices would increase, but I think it's reasonable to say that we should be focused on making sure that people in America are provided with purposeful and meaningful work that also pays a good wage. There's also a guest worker program, a seasonal visa for agricultural workers that has about 250,000 people in it in the past few years. If Trump wants to make the argument that there needs to be an expansion of that program to allow more seasonal farm workers to come in from South American and Central American countries. I think that would be much more reasonable than saying that farm owners get to basically skirt the law because they've made the argument to Trump that they need more people.
Yeah, in relation to the first point about American wages and American labor protections, I agree with that, at least in principle. And I think one of the places we have common ground here is that the plan that Trump seems to be suggesting in rather vague terms just seems wide open to abuse of all kinds. He talks about the idea that a farmer will come in with a letter concerning certain people saying they're great, they're working hard. Well, obviously that implies that workers who are most, least resistant to pushing for any improved working conditions or most resistant to any forms of unfair pay would not be obviously recommended by the employer. You have the additional problem that it's estimated that around 1/4 of agricultural workers are female, and I think there is obvious danger there for various forms of harassment or all sorts of weird incentives for female workers to be in the employer's good books with very little protection. So I think that is a real danger. I just think that if you make that argument, which some, as you know, on the left as well as the right make, that there has to be, one of the reasons to be more stringent about immigration is to improve working conditions for American citizens, then you have to accept that that will lead to increased prices and perhaps in the short term labor shortages while that all balances itself out.
Yeah, of course, and I completely acknowledge that. And getting to like a broader theme of this administration, I've been writing about this a lot, which is that there's going to be this inevitable tension between the big tech people, the corporatists, the billionaires, and the populists within the administration. And this is, I think, evidence of that playing out in real time, as has been the fight over tariffs, as has been the fight over H-1B visas, which we saw before Trump even took office. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy calling for a large expansion of the H-1B visa program. People like J.D. Vance and and Steve Bannon, who is obviously not in the Trump administration, but I think it's fair to say is sort of the early adopter of MAGA ideology outside of Trump. They've argued that the mass expansion of the H-1B visa program would crowd out American workers, suppress wages, etc. And Trump ultimately came out and said, I support H-1B. He didn't say whether or not he was going to expand it, but now he's offering this $5 million gold card that people can just buy to get access to the United States.
Cash for passports, effectively.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. So there's going to be a point, I think, where the people who voted for Trump because they are part of the working class and want him to make changes related to immigration on their behalf so that they can have better wages, more job opportunity, are going to start getting upset. and reasonably so, because that's not what he ran on, is catering to the interest of corporations.
Sure, and I mean, obviously we were talking about the tariffs earlier on in the trade war. It seems like that is, as you say, very much part of the same picture there, right? He has not done the thing that would have taken longer and involved more shorter-term pain, but would at least have had the potential, in theory, to increase American manufacturing and to provide more of those working-class jobs. And so this does get, I think, to some of the tensions in the Trump coalition, which you have just outlined, because you do have the Elon Musk people, frankly, the rich people, the business people, and against the sort of Bannon economic populist people. And, obviously those of us who are of a more liberal or lefty disposition have more in common with the Bannon people in that sense, even though there's massive disagreements with them in other ways, that it is sort of setting them up against corporate power. But the question is Trump ultimately going to end up siding with the corporate power side?
And I think on the tariff question, he sort of hit a middle ground, so to speak, with having still the 10% baseline, but not doing the full reciprocal tariff. I mean, if it were up to business owners, they would have no tariffs, right? So that was the middle ground. This doesn't feel like middle ground. I think the H-1B question, the gold card, was not middle ground. So there's going to be, I think, some pushback at some point if he continues making decisions that seem to favor the Jamie Dimons, the Elon Musks, the Bill Ackmans of the world over the working class.
I agree with you. So we have a point of agreement.
We do. Imagine that. Up next, a beef of all beefs between Daily Wire commentator Matt Walsh and podcast host Megyn Kelly. We'll explain. Like snow arriving in the winter, one can always count on some sort of infighting between online conservatives.
This time, the verbal scuffle is between Daily Wire commentator Matt Walsh and podcast host Megyn Kelly.
Apparently, it all started last year. Kelly had appeared on the Chicks on the Right podcast where she was asked about the apparent beef.
Here is co-host Miriam Weaver asking Kelly about the situation in 2024.
There was some controversy happening at the time with Matt Walsh, and I know you had a beef with him recently on Twitter. He's always been the same guy when it comes to women have their place and that needs to be at home and they shouldn't have careers and all that stuff. And I remember that I asked you about it in that show, and you said, I just know that having a career and family, having that career makes me the best version of myself for my family.
And here was Kelly's response.
Having said that, I like the guy. I'm getting a little tired of his nonstop judgment of women who make different choices than the ones he wants us to make. Sorry, Matt, you're not our Jesus. We don't answer to you. We're not judging moms who choose to stay at home and raise their kids.
Absolutely
That's a
not.
choice we celebrate. We love. Those are our sisters and our friends and our moms. Women aren't doing this to other women for the most part. It's guys like Matt. Like, shut up.
Fast forward to today, and Walsh is now flipping the script on Kelly. Here he is on his show this week.
Keep in mind the language that Megyn just used. She said that I don't understand women. I'm trying to control women. I'm trying to tell women what to do. I'm trying to be, Jesus? I'm trying to be the Jesus of women or whatever. I'm judging women. I'm putting up guardrails. Now, I don't think that that's an accurate characterization at all, but I do think that these terms would pretty well describe Megyn's attitude towards young men.
Kelly made some comments in a recent show with Young Turks host Anna Kasparian. Kelly said that nowadays the young conservative women she talks to are actually having a hard time finding a man.
A lot of conservative women tend to be God-loving conservatives, and they can't find a lot of young men who want to marry a working woman now. And this is an actual problem that's coming up on the right. And to me, it's so sad because it's like, how did we get to the point where we're now telling young, conservative, amazing women that they're not attractive if they also work?
As a result, Walsh is saying that while Kelly is accusing him of not understanding women, she doesn't seem, in his view, to understand men. Here's Walsh explaining the gist of his argument.
Men and women are different. They are looking for different things, Megyn. A man might be attracted to a woman with a career, but he's not going to be attracted to her because of her career. And a woman who puts her career before anything, a woman who prioritizes her professional ambitions above all else will be very unappealing to the vast majority of men. And I know that might be upsetting for you to hear, Megyn, but it's just true.
All right, so let's sum this all up. Kelly says that Walsh shouldn't tell women how to live their lives and that women should be career-oriented if they want to. She also says that many young conservative women she talks to can't find a man who wants a career-oriented woman.
Walsh, on the other hand, claims that men aren't attracted to women primarily because of how successful they are in their careers, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be ambitious. This, Walsh says, is a fundamental difference between what attracts men and women to each other. Well, Amber, let me, before I turn this over to you, say something that I've never said on this show,
Please.
Which is, I agree with Megyn Kelly. That is very, very rare for me to be in that position, but I want to hear what you think of all this.
Okay, so, oh gosh, I feel like I'm going to run headfirst into barbed wire here, but I actually tend to agree with Matt Walsh on this one.
See, there we go. It's going to be disagreement again.
I know. Okay, so I love Megyn Kelly, and I think it's absolutely the case that, there are women who value and prioritize their career over all else, and there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. That's their choice to make. But I do think Matt has a point when he says that men are not primarily attracted to women because of their job title or the amount of money that they make. And I think it can be unappealing to the type of men who want to get married and have children to know that perhaps their wife would not step away from a career to help raise the children or would be reluctant to stay home as a stay-at-home mom. And I think that's just the reality of biological differences.
I think we're all going to run into barbed wire on this one. I mean, the thing that I have an issue with primarily about what Walsh says is that I think he's extrapolating what he wants, and he is, he married a long time, and he can seek whatever he wishes in a spouse or mate, but to what men want writ large. Now, Megyn Kelly is making a slightly different argument specifically about conservative men. Walsh is making these sweeping statements that men are not attracted to women, not generally attracted to career-driven women. And I just think that's nonsense. It may be true that certain men would prefer a more quote-unquote trad wife type role, and it may be true that other men think differently about that. But he seems to me I do think that there is, in the way he talks about it, an implicit moral scolding of women who work outside the home or who are ambitious in their careers. And he is, and here's where I agree with Megyn Kelly, there is, I think, the implication that you are making yourself unattractive by doing that. And I think that is a firstly incorrect message to put out, but also a potentially damaging one, especially for women who are of a more conservative disposition and might seek the same in a spouse.
Yeah, I think it is a little nuanced in that it's not about women wanting to have a career or being ambitious, but it's about the choice that you ultimately make when you start a family and when you decide to have children. And I think it's fair to say that the average man, and I know I'm generalizing, but I think it's fair to say that the average man probably envisions some kind of more traditional arrangement where the woman stays home with the kids and the man is the breadwinner. And a lot of women like that arrangement too. And it's not about being unattractive, but it's about, I think, a woman's priorities. And if her priority is to continue working and drop the kids off at daycare, I think it's reasonable for a man to say, I'm not compatible with you because I want to marry someone who is going to take an active role in raising the kids.
I would, in the specifics of the example that you just outlined, I would agree with you that it is not a wrong decision for a man in that circumstance to say, no, that's a sort of fundamental difference, and therefore it goes to quite a fundamental issue in our lives, and therefore there is incompatibility. What I object to in Walsh's case is that he didn't seem to me to reflect any of the nuance that you have just done. And his argument seemed to be that there is a right way and a wrong way of doing this, or there is a way of women being focused on their careers that is a turn-off to men. And I just think that that vastly oversimplifies. It's way beyond, you used the word generalization, I think. To me, that is way beyond just generalization and into a kind of almost slightly fetishistic and anachronistic view of family life, where in fact there are innumerable different ways of living a family life where both partners are satisfied professionally, romantically, all the other ways, and it does not require fitting into Matt Walsh's template. And so Megyn Kelly's crack about the Jesus to women or whatever, I think is I assume, emanating from that sense that he's just seeking to dictate terms that he might like and he is free to like that are not even remotely universal, and potentially making women, conservative women in particular, feel uneasy about very legitimate choices.
I think sometimes there's something to be said for the hard truth. And I view this as the hard truth. It is a hard truth that if you are a conservative woman and you want to marry a conservative man, you likely are going, if you want that to be successful and if you want to raise a conservative family, you probably are going to have a hard time finding a conservative man to marry if you are not willing to put career aside to raise kids. It may not be what they want to hear. It might be going against the way that they envision their lives, and they're allowed to feel that way, and they're certainly allowed to prioritize marrying someone who doesn't want them to do that. But what I actually think Matt is getting at here is a deeper biological fact that is actually, despite his perhaps harsh delivery, intended to help those women. I really do believe that.
I don't know how easy it is to separate it from the harsh delivery. And I also wonder, you know, the conversation here has focused a lot on the raising of children. And that wasn't all that he was talking about. He was talking about having a focus on career and being ambitious as inherently unattractive things.
I think it was a little differently phrased than that. It was more that they don't view that as a primary driver of why they're attracted to a woman. So like a woman typically would favor having a man who is ambitious, who can provide for a family, whereas Matt Walsh says when a man is picking a mate, they're not looking at the woman's earning potential or her ability to propel herself through her career, but he's looking at some of these other factors. So it's not that they're mutually exclusive, but it's not the thing that men prioritize when deciding who they want to marry.
But if they are not mutually exclusive, his bigger argument and the harshness with which it is put seem to me then inappropriate, because if your argument is, well, it's more nuanced than that and these things are compatible, they may not be the number one thing for men and they may more frequently be the number one thing for women, that is one argument. That is different from saying that men are not attracted to women who are ambitious.
Oh, I think Megyn Kelly said that, not Matt Walsh.
Well, he said she was right, though. So, I mean, he's agreeing with that argument.
That women are not attractive. Well, again, I think it's two different things here. So what Matt Walsh is saying is that men don't prioritize a woman's career orientation as an attractive trait. And when Megyn Kelly was talking about it, she was getting into the idea of career being the first priority for women. So those are two separate things. It's one thing to say that women who are working, their job title, their earning potential doesn't really matter to the man. That's not what he's determining as whether or not he's attracted to a woman. Megyn Kelly is getting into something which is a little bit different, which is that a woman who thinks her career is perhaps the purpose of her life, the thing that gives her life meaning, and is a priority over things like family and children, that is not attractive to a man. And I actually agree with Matt Walsh on that point too.
Yeah, but then you see, there is a question, I think, about, you just said they're attractive to a man. And then the example that we were talking about earlier was a conservative woman seeking a conservative man. So this is where it does, I think, get tricky. Obviously, there are lots of very career-focused women who are married, who are happily married, who are attractive to their spouses. Now, if you're talking about someone who has the social attitudes of a Matt Walsh, then he would not be seeking that kind of woman as his spouse. Okay, but this gets back to where we started off, which is that I think he is overgeneralizing in a vast way what men want, so if that's a blanket term, and then when he's called on it, taking sort of refuge in the idea that, well, I'm really meaning people who are conservative or socially conservative. What he's basically saying is people who agree with me.
It is fair to say, though, that young men have gotten more conservative over the past 10 years. And there have been a number of studies, including one on Medium and one published in the New York Times, that show that young millennials and Gen Z men actually do have more conservative attitudes towards things like a traditional family structure of a woman being a stay-at-home mom. So in that sense, if the majority of young men, who are the men most likely to be seeking a marriage, do agree with those values, then I think he's actually right to make that generalization.
So I'll make a final Team Megyn
I'll let you
point
get the
here,
last point.
which is unusual, which is that I think she made the point in one of the clips we played about the idea that are the changes that you just outlined sort of organic, or are they just a reaction to whatever, social changes, or are those being accelerated by people on the online male right who are putting forth ideas that I think she thinks are unhealthy, I would say.
Okay.
There we go. Up next, remember all those drones flying over New Jersey? Apparently it's not over. Stay with us.
Mysterious unknown drones piqued the interest of the public, politicians alike between 2024 and early 2025. Numerous reports of these flying craft were reported along the East Coast, specifically in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The FBI, DHS, FAA, and the DoD issued a joint statement in December declaring that they were not from an enemy, but instead from hobbyists, law enforcement planes, and helicopters mistaken for drones.
Mystery objects exhibiting advanced technology are still loitering in our skies, apparently, at times near military installations and even close to nuclear power plants. Joining us now to dive in is Marik Von Rennenkampff, a contributor for The Hill. Welcome, Marik.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think for a lot of people, these drones dropped off the radar, so to speak, after that announcement that we alluded to in December. But you think that that is incorrect and that we should still be, I think, concerned about these things. So what's going on?
We should absolutely still be concerned about these sightings. And I just want to say that I bring a kind of a national security perspective to this. And I'm not so much focused on let's call it hysteria. A lot of what we did see in New Jersey was indeed hysteria. I have a minor bone to pick with your producers because the footage you showed was actually of an airliner. So there was a rampant misidentification in those New Jersey incidents that generated all those headlines. But I am far more concerned about 6 or 7 years now worth of intrusions, just brazen, blatant intrusions over sensitive military sites. And we can dive into those, but the bottom line is these objects have been hovering over nuclear missile facilities in Nebraska. They've been swarming ships 100 miles off the coast of California, as many as a dozen at a time. The only imagery that we've actually seen of these objects is of a spherical object that slowly moves across the screen in front of a Navy destroyer and then descends into the ocean. So it's a mystery, and somebody, from my perspective, some unknown actor is putting on just a brazen display of impunity.
Yeah, and just to go back a little bit to the varying explanations we've had of what these objects are from our government, I've been very dissatisfied with that because when this New Jersey incident happened, when we saw the drones there and the planes and helicopters that were misidentified, as you said, At first, the government said that it was all hobbyists. It was nothing to worry about. It was private individuals using the drones. Well, then there were multiple reports of them flying over these military installations. Now, I don't think anyone believes that the government or the military would simply allow a hobbyist to fly a drone over a military installation and do nothing about it. And so, to me, that fuels the speculation that this is either government property or that of a foreign actor, and they're worried about sparking some kind of conflict if they decide to shoot them down. What's your take on that?
You hit the nail on the head, and I suspect that the vast majority of the government is truly mystified and stumped by this, and they're in kind of damage control mode, and they're just punting. They don't know what to say, so they punt. We saw this with the Biden administration. They had horrendous messaging on this. Trump pledged to get to the bottom of this on day one. And then as soon as he got into office, same thing, horrendous messaging. They have no answers. And I want to point your viewers to a recent 60 Minutes piece that actually, there were three four-star generals, two recently retired and one active four-star general, two of them responsible for aerospace defense over North America, NORAD. And those collectively, those 12 stars said, we have no idea what's going on. We tried jamming these objects. They are impervious to jamming. We have no imagery on them. And just to kind of bolster that point, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Wicker, said, and he's a member of the Gang of Eight, he is read into truly the highest security, the highest level security briefings available. And the direct quote is, the Pentagon is, quote, still mystified by these incursions after 6 years of consistent incursions, brazen incursions, again, with flashing lights that occurred over and over and over. So this is a major issue, regardless of it's China, Russia, hobbyists, which I think we can, let's not rule anything out, regardless of its non-human intelligence, that buzzword. This is a major crisis, it's a concern, and nobody's really paying attention to it from my perspective.
So two things, Marik. One is in relation to the point you just raised. I was struck reading one of your recent pieces for The Hill about how long this has actually been going on, because I had thought that the drones thing basically came to prominence last fall, the period that we were alluding to in our introduction. And you mentioned the fact that back in 2019, objects with bright flashing lights swarmed some of the Navy's most advanced warships over the coast of California. There was an instance in 2023 over an Air Force base, and this goes beyond the US as well. There was a series of incursions over American bases in the UK. So firstly, this has been going on a while. Secondly, it has a large geographical range. But thirdly, what is your best guess as to what this is all about?
Now we're getting into speculation territory where I'm fairly, frankly, uncomfortable going. But okay. I have a hard time that China or Russia or an adversary would do such a brazen display. So I'll just take the Langley Air Force Base example, which is in late 2023. For 17 nights, objects with bright flashing lights hovered and flew over that facility. The Air Force, the FBI, and NASA, which has a facility there, were clueless. They had completely outgunned. They had no idea what to do and what to make of these incidents, which is extraordinary. So I have a hard time thinking that a foreign adversary would be so brazen, because that risks a major geopolitical crisis. It's possible, but it does risk a major geopolitical crisis. Rule number one of surveillance is be stealthy, don't be caught. And bright flashing lights tends to kind of go against that basic of tradecraft, of intelligence collection tradecraft. Hobbyists, I have a hard time believing that. So that raises countless questions. The plot really thickens, Niall, when you look back to the historical record. And there are numerous documented incidents, this is in government records, where objects with bright flashing lights hovered, flew in formation over sensitive military facilities. I'll give you one example. In 1965, several hundred objects were observed by nuclear missile security forces above F.E. Warren Air Force Base. And if you read the report, it's exactly what we're seeing today.
So talking to other people who cover this issue, one of the things I hear consistently is that there's effectively two reasons why the U.S. government will never admit that they are mystified by these objects. One, of course, is not to cause public panic, But the other is that if these are flying objects that are from the Chinese or the Russians, the U.S. would be effectively admitting to their global adversaries that they are not familiar with technology that they possess. Do you think that that is a possibility? And sorry to put you back in speculation zone again, but is it possible that China does have some kind of aircraft, that technology that the U.S. doesn't have access to, and they're reluctant to admit that publicly because they don't want to give China the win?
It's absolutely possible. I'm open to all scenarios, but my analytic brain tends to doubt that theory because the Chinese, you can just look this up, right? They've struggled with basic jet engine technology. They copy and steal, frankly, a lot of the technology that they put out from the United States. When they put out a new fighter, it just looks exactly like our previous generation of fighters. But look, I'm open to any possibilities. But when you think about the behavior and kind of the brazen display of this, I don't think any country would just float and highlight for all military eyes to see its most advanced technology for 17 nights, for example, over an Air Force base, a critical Air Force base. But hey, look, I'm open to it, and I think that's all the more reason. Let's remove sourcing and origin of these objects and these incidents. Let's just treat this as a crisis, because it is. And frankly, the media has done an abysmal job of reporting on this, and kudos to you guys for covering it.
Well, thank you. And I tend to agree with you on the Chinese technology point. On the brazenness, they did fly a spy balloon across the entire continental U.S., so I guess anything is possible. Real quick,
Can I quickly just add on that? I'll just add on the Chinese spy balloon. I think we've now heard from President Biden and the former NORAD commander, and there's been reporting in the Washington Post that I think the consensus in the national security community is that spy balloon was intended to fly over Hawaii and Guam and was caught up in unseasonable winds. And that's I think we have now enough sources saying that that's what actually happened, and that was not the intent. That's not to say China is a major adversary, and I'm not downplaying that, but I just want to be crystal clear on the data and the facts as we know them as they stand today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the update on that story. And Mark, thanks for joining us this morning on Rising.
Thanks so much for having me.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, crusade is starting to take shape. The Secretary made a shocking pledge about it yesterday during President Trump's cabinet meeting. Let's take a look at that.
We are going to know by September. We've launched a massive testing and research effort that's going to involve hundreds of scientists from around the world. By September, we will know what has caused the autism epidemic, and we'll be able to eliminate those exposures.
RFK Jr. has not yet offered any details about what the study will involve or how it will be different than previous studies. Trump also echoed Kennedy's message yesterday. Let's watch.
There's got to be something artificial out there that's doing this. So you think you're going to have a pretty good idea, huh?
We will know by September.
There will be no bigger news conference than that. So that's it. If you can come up with that answer where you stop taking something, you stop eating something, or maybe it's a shot, but something's causing it.
Dr. Neil Stone took to X to call out Kennedy, writing, "Anyone who claims that they will crack such a complex problem in 5 months is a fraud," which is exactly what RFK Jr. is. He also added, RFK Jr. is not on a mission to discover the cause of autism. He is on a mission to blame it on vaccines. Kennedy is indeed a long-time vaccine critic. He has pushed discredited theories that blame childhood vaccines for problems with developmental development. It is important to note that decades of research has concluded there is no link between vaccines and autism. But nevertheless, we will be waiting for our RFK Jr.'s report in September and his findings. I am very skeptical of RFK Jr., as regular viewers of this show know. I think that he has a propensity to push junk science, and I think that could cause real harm in this case and in others. I note that the person who is going to be leading this study is a man by the name of David, I believe it's pronounced Geyer or Gear. He was disciplined more than a decade ago, according to the Washington Post, for practicing medicine without a license. I think that RFK Jr.'s beliefs about vaccines and autism are, at least in broad terms, pretty clear. There was the famous 1998 study that proposed such a link and was later retracted, and the British person actually, Andrew Wakefield, who was behind that, was struck off the medical register. As we noted in the introduction, there have been numerous studies that have found no link.
Yeah, I think studying what causes autism is a really worthy underlying goal.
I agree with that.
But I do agree that the timeline is absurd. 5 months, September,
Right.
I don't think anybody believes that that is at all possible. I don't even know how you could conduct a full study of that nature in that amount of time. And I am concerned that because of RFK's views about vaccines, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't, will cause him to look at this issue rather myopically and not in its totality. So those are my concerns with it. And yeah, just I want this to be done in the right way because I do think it is actually really important.
No, absolutely. And I mean, look, I think that any major condition or ailment or problem in the health sphere is obviously worthy of proper study. The thing is that there have been an abundance of studies on this topic. I mean, just to set as a counterpoint to the one in 1998 that was withdrawn, there's a Danish study, and it studied in thousands and thousands of children over 7 years, and for almost half a million children, and found no connection, no difference between the risk of autism between those who had been vaccinated and those who had not. And I think to your point about the brevity of the study, that seems to me to just fuel the idea that this is a study where the conclusion or the desired conclusion is to be set at the start, and the things that should lead to a conclusion are going to be manipulated or shaded in that way. And I think that's very, very dangerous. On the point of autism, which is of course a serious problem, I mean, it just seems to me that one of the reasons for these spikes in autism rates is in fact an increase in diagnosis, and the fact that I think a decade or so ago, there was seemingly a shift between, autism used to be diagnosed primarily with people who were suffering from what we would now think of as severe autism, which is obviously a very debilitating condition. Now there is the whole sense of the autism spectrum, which tends to, I think, lead to much broader diagnoses, and that does not necessarily mean an actual rise in the problem.
Yeah, I think the diagnosis is one part of it, but not fully explanatory. And one of the main reasons that I think that is true is because we have not yet seen autism diagnosis rates level out as we would typically see with an increase in diagnoses. For example, with left-handedness, around 1960, you started to see actually the level of people who were left-handed start to level out because they got over the sort of fear about a child being left-handed. And we actually saw similar things in the gay community, where the number of people, gay men who were identifying that way, leveled off around 2019, 2020, and the rates stayed relatively the same. Meanwhile, we've seen a massive explosion in bisexual women, which is very fascinating. But we have not seen that similar leveling off of autism rates, even though we've had now 35 years of more acceptance and diagnoses of that nature. So I do think there is something more going on. Of course, I couldn't possibly say what it is. I would also say, in general, I think it's important to not reflexively rely on old studies. And I'm not saying that the studies that you're referring to on vaccines and links to autism are incorrect, but I think on a general principle, it is important sometimes to go back and challenge our assumptions. Marty McCary, who is a new member of the Trump administration, had a really fascinating book, Blind Spots, which was one of my beach reads this past summer. And he talked about how so many base assumptions made by medical doctors have found out to be based on junk science. For example, the idea that peanut butter allergies can be avoided by not doing early exposure to things like peanuts or peanut butter in your children. And it turned out that was actually the exact opposite of recommended advice. You actually should be giving your child small amounts of peanut butter to stave off allergy when they're young. Things like People shouldn't be eating egg yolks because they cause high cholesterol, when the benefits of eating egg yolks far outweigh the risk of higher cholesterol. And is high cholesterol even necessarily a huge problem if you don't have some underlying heart condition in the first place? Should older women be doing hormone replacement therapy to stave off osteoporosis and other problems with aging because it severely raises the risk of cervical cancer? It turned out that wasn't really true. So I do think it's nice to have people in the administration who have this sort of general perspective towards science, that it's not always settled. On this particular issue, I do worry much that you do, that this will not actually be a full look at the drivers of autism and will be primarily focused on vaccines, which I don't think is necessarily wrong on its face, but it's a little bit too myopic.
On the point that you raised about all the past things that has changed, I entirely agree, and I think it is one of the great strengths of properly conducted science that it is iterative, right? You come up with a thesis, you test it, it seems to be right, you think that looks right, and then someone comes up with further studies or further experiments that call that into question, and the scientific consensus shifts in some way. And obviously that is literally how we acquire knowledge, is that it accrues over time. That seems to me different from the Kennedy perspective, where I do think that he's starting off with a conclusion, and that's not where you should be starting off. The other thing, just on a general level about health, is his statement is that we will find the cause, but like there is not a cause of heart disease or stroke or any number of health problems. There's some suggestion, for example, with the autism thing, that maybe it could be related to exposure to pesticides. There's some question that maybe very premature babies are more prone to it. There could be all sorts of risk factors, including, of course, genetics. But the idea that we're going to find the cause in 5 months, I think that's...
Yeah, I think risk factor is a good way of putting it. I will also add one final point of skepticism on this, is that there would be massive liability if he were to find that there were some pharmaceutical answer for the driver of autism. Can you imagine how many families are going to sue pharmaceutical manufacturers? This would be quite the test of whether or not RFK is truly divorced from those groups if he were to go through with this, and I'm curious to see what happens there.
True enough.
Up next, the language police hit the Masters as allegations erupt around the gifting of valuable tickets to government officials. That's next. You might need to keep your Merriam-Webster handy to sound proper enough for the Augusta National Golf Club. For all the non-golf geeks, the 2025 Masters at Augusta National in Georgia started on Thursday and will run through Sunday.
The club has a lot of rules, like no cell phones and no sitting on the grass. They don't have fans, they have patrons. And there are also many unwritten rules on how to behave and what is considered acceptable language.
The Washington Post provided this analogy of language policing at the Masters. Here's the unedited version of a sports narration. On Thursday, when round one of the Masters gets underway, the threesomes will include defending champion Scottie Scheffler and his playing partners Justin Thomas and Jose Luis Ballester. The range will buzz with activity as the field warms up.
And if that was edited according to the Masters' accepted words and lingo, here's how it would sound. On Thursday, when the first round of the Masters gets underway, the groupings will include defending champion Scottie Scheffler and his competitors, Justin Thomas and Jose Luis Ballester. The tournament practice area will buzz with activity as the field warms up.
And what's a posh golf tournament without its fancy, high-profile guests? According to the Wall Street Journal, Augusta National has gifted scores of highly coveted and valuable tickets to high-ranking city employees and elected officials. Some of those tickets, especially the rare Masters Series badges that grant access to all 4 rounds of the tournament, can sell for more than $20,000. Late Clifford Roberts and Robert Tyler Jones Jr. co-founded the Augusta National Golf Club in 1932, and the Masters debuted 2 years later.
So you're a keen golfer for a start, Amber. I have not played since a very, very long time ago. But this language, is that specifically Augusta obviously has a lot of rules around it and a lot of rules around the Masters. So this is another example of their rather, I don't know what you're, elitist or whatever attitudes?
Look, it's a tradition unlike any other, and I kind of love it. I mean, there's things like the Waste Management Open where fans are encouraged to heckle the golfers and they throw beer in the air and people take their shirts off when they hole a chip, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But then on the other side of the coin, you have the Masters, which is very buttoned up and very serious, and it's at this beautiful, meticulously maintained golf course. And I think there's something fun about that. It's sort of the one thing a year that golf fans get to watch and see the really long-standing tradition of the game. And there's I have a bone to pick with the Wall Street Journal, actually.
Okay, excellent.
Because when they're talking about these tickets being gifted to local government officials, I mean, first of all, there's hardly any corruption going on here. Augusta National donates tons of money to the city every year. They are largely responsible for a lot of the city's income through this golf tournament. It's basically a ghost town the rest of the year. And there's no indication that any local government officials would be suddenly trying to shut down the Masters if they weren't getting these tickets. Not to mention the fact that you're not allowed to sell them on the second market. So this line about how, well, you could sell them for $20,000. Yeah, and you'd be banned for life because they have really strict regulations and police it very aggressively. The Wall Street Journal reporter, or someone from the Wall Street Journal, actually posted it on the golf subreddit, which I am a ardent
Proud member of.
And the comments in response are hysterical because they posted this, of course, thinking, oh, we're going to get the golfers to read our investigative report on the tickets. And instead they got absolutely roasted by all of these golfers, telling them that they were engaging in lazy journalism. One guy, I love this comment, said, "The audacity, it's exactly reasons like this that I'm running for mayor of the city of Augusta," and he crossed out "to reap the benefits," to fight these injustices.
I mean, it does seem from what you say to be a bit of a stretch to suggest that people are being bribed out of, anti-US Masters positions by free tickets. That seems highly unlikely.
The idea that like a mayor of a city where the Super Bowl is being hosted wouldn't get a free ticket to attend the Super Bowl. I mean, I think that's probably the most comparable analogy.
Yeah,
so.
But on the point of the language that we started off with, it doesn't appear to me, reading the amendments that we just noted, it's not certainly an attempt to use, politically correct language as such. It's really about a more formal language there. For example, not saying playing partners and competitors. I don't know what their objection is to the word range. I mean, in my rudimentary knowledge of golf, I thought that everyone referred to the driving range, but the tournament practice area it is.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a collective term to refer to the practice green and the chipping green. Who knows? They also do not have rough at Augusta. It is called the second cut. And that actually there's a legitimate reason behind that. Augusta National famously did not have any rough for a very long time. They added it fairly recently, but it's still much lower than your typical rough. It's like 1 3/4 inches or something higher than the fairway is. And so technically it is a second cut. It's not really rough. They also call the pine needles pine straw. I mean, to me, it's all just kind of like the fun formality of it all and sort of the tradition of it. And it, like you said, it's not like woke language policing, really.
No. I'm also not hostile to the idea in any kind of sports of people who are a bit more purist about it, which seems to be the Augusta way. I'll get roasted myself for this in the comments by diverting to talk about cricket, but it was the sport that I played most seriously growing up. And the purest form of cricket is Test cricket, which takes place over 5 days and frequently ends in a draw. It is ill-fitted to the modern age, so all sorts of crowd numbers are going down. And now they've very quick cricket, which takes like an afternoon and is coloured clothing and music and all the rest. It's entertaining, but it's not the real thing. The real thing is the 5-day one that takes forever and is played in whites and is properly formal and official. So I prefer that. So I'll analogize that with your golf version.
And a lot of people feel that way about, the PGA Tour versus LIV, which has golf teams. And they compete in these events that are typically only 2 or 3 days as opposed to the full 4. I think both have value, but it is an ongoing debate in golf. I feel like I should give my Masters picks.
Absolutely.
Really quickly.
Please do.
Okay, so I would say my top 2 picks are either Scottie Scheffler for a repeat win or Bryson DeChambeau.
go and gamble according to Amber's opinions on these
Please
things.
don't. I do not want to be held liable.
Off and put all your money on Scotty Chef.
Oh boy. All right. Well, that's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.